You probably think that evolution is a straight line pointing up. It's a comforting thought, isn't it? You look at the history of life on Earth as a long, arduous climb from single-celled organisms to fish, to lizards, to mammals, and finally, inevitably, to you, the big-brained primate holding a smartphone. We like to believe that human history is a story of constant upgrades, where we get taller, stronger, and most importantly, smarter with every passing millennium. But you are wrong. The fossil record doesn't care about our ego, and it tells a very different, much more unsettling story. In fact, for the last several thousand years, we haven't been upgrading at all. We've been downsizing. The biological organ responsible for every symphony, every skyscraper, and every scientific breakthrough you see around you is actually significantly smaller today than it was when our ancestors were painting on cave walls. And the reason why lies buried in the dirt of the Holocene epoch, hidden inside a paradox that scientists are still fighting over today. Tonight, we are going to explore why your brain is smaller than a caveman's. If you appreciate content that respects your intelligence and helps you unwind with deep history, take a second to subscribe now. It's the best way to support this archive. Now, put your phone aside, dim the lights, and let the outside world fade away. Let's figure out what happened. We need to start by confronting the physical reality of your own head. It feels substantial enough, resting there on your pillow. It is the command center of your entire existence, a biological computer that burns through calories and processes terabytes of sensory data every second. For over 2 million years, the history of our genus, Homo, was defined by the relentless expansion of this organ. It was an arms race of neurons. From the modest 450 cubic centimeters of our distant cousins, the Australopithecines, to the emergent 600 or 800 cubic centimeters of Homo habilis, the trend was always more. Nature was investing heavily in neural tissue, betting that the calorie cost was worth the survival payout. But then, something strange happened. Sometime after the peak of the last ice age, that trajectory didn't just stall, it reversed. This isn't a fringe theory or a statistical error. It is a robust, verified fact, grounded in osteological records that span tens of thousands of years. When paleoanthropologists measure the skulls of modern humans, people like you and me, and compare them to our ancestors from 30,000 years ago, they find a deficit. Our brains are approximately 10% to 17% smaller than theirs. To visualize this, I want you to imagine holding a tennis ball in your hand. Feel the fuzzy texture, the curve of it, the weight. A standard tennis ball has a volume of roughly 150 cubic centimeters. That is almost exactly the amount of brain matter you are missing compared to a late Pleistocene hunter. If you were to stand next to your great-great-great-grandfather from the Stone Age, his cranial capacity would average around 1,500 cubic centimeters, while yours hovers around 1,350 cubic centimeters. You are fundamentally a lighter model. You have been optimized, or perhaps diminished, by about 1 tennis ball's worth of gray matter. This phenomenon is known as the Holocene Encephalization Reversal. It's a dry, academic term for a profound biological mystery. It presents us with a massive paradox. Precisely as human civilization began its exponential rise, as we started building temples, inventing agriculture, forming armies, and writing down our history, the biological engine responsible for all of it began to atrophy. You might be tempted to think this is just a regional quirk. Maybe it only happened to people in Europe, or maybe it's a result of a specific diet in one part of the world. But the decline is pervasive. It didn't just happen to one group, it happened to almost everyone. The data is relentlessly consistent. In Europe and North Africa, the trend of de-encephalization is clearly documented, kicking off in the Mesolithic era and accelerating as we moved into the Neolithic. But if you travel down to sub-Saharan Africa, you see the exact same thing. Researchers like Henneberg and Stein found a similar decrease in brain size there, which essentially kills the idea that our brains only shrank because the weather got warmer in the north. Go east, and the story remains the same. In China, cranial series ranging from the Neolithic period to the present day show a distinct reduction, with some studies suggesting the shrinkage actually sped up in the last few thousand years. Even in Australia, among indigenous populations who maintained a hunter-gatherer lifestyle much longer than their agricultural counterparts, the fossil record shows a trend toward gracilization, a thinning of the bone and a reduction in cranial capacity. It wasn't a male thing or a female thing either. The reduction hit everyone. Foundational analyses of thousands of crania indicate that male brain size dropped by about 10%, while female brain size dropped by nearly 17%. Whatever invisible hand was pressing down on our biology, it was pressing down on the entire species. So here you are, lying in the dark, a member of the most technologically advanced society Earth has ever seen, operating with hardware that is significantly downgraded from the factory settings of your ancestors. It defies common sense. We usually associate big brains with high intelligence, complex problem-solving, and dominance. If survival of the fittest is the law of the land, why would nature select for a smaller processor? Did we get dumber? Did we get more efficient? Or did we simply outsource our intelligence to the world around us, allowing our individual tanks to run a little closer to empty? To answer that, we have to leave the modern world behind. We need to go back to the moment before the slide began. We need to stand face to face with the gold standard of human engineering, the people who set the benchmark we have since failed to meet. We need to go back to the Ice Age. Let's drift back in time. Let the walls of your bedroom dissolve into the cold, sharp air of the late Pleistocene. You are standing on a ridge overlooking a vast, wind-swept tundra in what will one day be called France. It is 25,000 years ago. The world is gripped by ice. The glaciers have pushed deep into the continent, locking up the oceans and turning the landscape into a dry, unforgiving steppe. This is a hard world, a place where a single mistake, a missed track, a broken spear tip, a misread cloud pattern, means death. And walking across this ridge, you see them. They are your ancestors, the people anthropologists classify as Cro-Magnon, the early European modern humans. As you watch them move, the first thing you notice is their presence. They are not the stooped, grunting caricatures from old cartoons. They are tall, physically imposing, and incredibly robust. Their bones are thick, scarred by the sheer muscle mass required to wrestle a living from the megafauna that roam the valleys below. But if you look closer, specifically at their faces, you notice something else. They have high foreheads, wide cheekbones, and powerful jaws. And behind those features lies a cranial vault that puts yours to shame. These people are the titans of human neurobiology. If you were to take a measuring tape to the skulls of the group walking past you, you would find that their average brain volume is approximately 1,478 cubic centimeters. A specific subset of these individuals, the classic Cro-Magnon specimens, boast an average of 1,514 cubic centimeters, and it is not uncommon to find individuals in this era with cranial capacities exceeding 1,600 cubic centimeters, a volume that is exceedingly rare to find in any human population walking the earth today. This was the standard. This was normal. To understand why they were built this way, you have to understand their life. They didn't have the luxury of specialization. There were no grocery stores, no GPS satellites, no doctors, and no police. A Cro-Magnon adult had to be a polymath of survival. They carried a massive internal library of information that had to be accessible at a moment's notice. Imagine the cognitive load. They had to memorize the taxonomy of hundreds of plant species, which ones heal a wound, which ones stop a fever, and which ones stop your heart. They had to hold complex, three-dimensional mental maps of territories that spanned hundreds of miles, recalling the location of water sources that might only be active for a few weeks a year. They had to understand the behavioral patterns of dangerous predators and elusive prey, predicting the movement of a reindeer herd based on the shift of the wind. They had to manufacture tools from stone and bone, a process that requires a sophisticated understanding of fracture mechanics and geometry. And on top of all that, they had to navigate the intricate, high-stakes politics of their tribe, maintaining the kinship networks that kept them alive. Every single adult had to be a genius of the natural world. There was no cloud to store this data. There were no books. The only hard drive available was the neocortex. If you forgot how to knap a flint blade or identify a poisonous berry, you didn't just fail a test. You died, and your genes died with you. So nature invested. For millions of years, the pressure was relentless. Build a bigger computer. The result was the 1,500 cubic centimeter engine inside the skull of that hunter standing on the ridge. Now, bring yourself back to the present for a moment. Feel the weight of your own head again. The global average for a contemporary human is about 1,350 cubic centimeters. We have lost roughly 150 to 200 cubic centimeters of volume compared to the people you just saw. This is the Cro-Magnon benchmark. It stands as a stark, undeniable peak in our biological history. We hit the zenith of our potential investment in neural tissue right there, in the bitter cold of the Ice Age. We built the ultimate survival machine, a creature capable of outthinking the harshest climate Earth could throw at it. And then we stopped. The question that keeps paleoanthropologists up at night is, why? Biological tissue is expensive. The brain is the most energy-hungry organ in the body. It consumes about 20% of your metabolic energy, despite only making up about 2% of your body weight. Nature is a ruthless accountant. It does not pay for luxury features. If a 1,500 cubic centimeter brain was necessary for survival 25,000 years ago, why is a 1,350 cubic centimeter brain sufficient today? Did we lose something vital, or did we simply find a way to hack the system, achieving more output with less hardware? To find the answer, we have to look away from the freezing tundra of Europe. Because, as it turns out, this wasn't just happening to the reindeer hunters. The signal for downsizing was about to ring out across the entire planet. You might be lying there thinking that this sounds like a very specific problem. Maybe the Cro-Magnons were just freaks of nature, oversized biological anomalies who lived in a frozen wasteland and needed massive heads to keep warm. Maybe the rest of the human species was cruising along with sensible, modest brains, and the shrinkage is just a statistical illusion caused by comparing ourselves to a few Ice Age giants in Europe. It's a reasonable doubt. Science is full of red herrings, and it would be comforting to dismiss this whole phenomenon as a regional quirk of the French Alps. But the fossil record is stubborn. It refuses to let us off the hook that easily. If we leave the glaciers of Europe and travel thousands of miles south, crossing the Mediterranean and the Sahara, we arrive in the heat of sub-Saharan Africa. Here, the environmental pressures were completely different. There were no mammoths to hunt in blizzards, no need to conserve body heat against sub-zero winds. Yet, the signal remains the same. Researchers Henneberg and Stein conducted deep analyses of cranial samples from this region, and what they found mirrors the European data perfectly. The human populations here also experienced a significant decrease in brain size as they moved from the Stone Age into the Iron Age and beyond. This is a critical piece of the puzzle because it destroys the simplest explanation: that our brains only shrank because our bodies shrank in response to a warming world. If the reduction was purely about adapting to the end of the Ice Age, we shouldn't see such a profound shift in the tropics, where the climate remained relatively stable. But we do. The de-encephalization was tracking humanity, not just the weather. Now, let's span the globe to East Asia. In China, the story repeats itself with eerie precision. Studies by Brown and later by Liu and colleagues examined cranial series stretching from the Neolithic period, the dawn of farming, right up to the present day. They found a clear directional reduction. As the rice paddies expanded and the villages grew into towns, the skulls of the people building them got smaller. Some of this data even suggests that the rate of change accelerated in the last 3,000 or 4,000 years, implying that as Chinese civilization became more complex, the biological hardware became more streamlined. Perhaps most surprisingly, the trend even touched the isolated continent of Australia. The indigenous populations here maintained a hunter-gatherer lifestyle long after agriculture had swept through Eurasia. They didn't build walled cities or plant monoculture crops in the same way the Neolithic farmers did. Theoretically, if the shrinkage was strictly caused by becoming a lazy farmer, they should have been immune. They should have retained the robust, high-volume crania of the Pleistocene. Yet the Holocene record in Australia also shows a trend toward gracilization, a lightening of the bone structure, and a reduction in cranial capacity. This global consistency is what makes the Holocene Encephalization Reversal so haunting. It wasn't a local adaptation. It wasn't a cultural fad. It was a ubiquitous update to the human operating system that rolled out across the entire planet. Whether you were tracking kangaroos in the outback, planting millet in the Yellow River Valley, or smelting iron in the Bantu expansion, your biology was drifting in the same direction. It suggests that the drivers of this change were fundamental to the post-Pleistocene human experience. Something shifted in the way we lived, the way we ate, or the way we interacted that made the expensive brain of our ancestors obsolete. Nature, in her infinite efficiency, looked at that extra 150 cubic centimeters of gray matter, that tennis ball of neurons, and decided it was dead weight. To understand why nature would make such a drastic cut, we have to look at what came before. We have to understand the momentum that this reversal stopped. Because for 2 million years, the rule wasn't shrink. The rule was grow at all costs. We need to appreciate the sheer magnitude of the biological investment we walked away from. We need to go back to the deep time of the Great Expansion. To truly appreciate the strangeness of what is happening inside your skull right now, we have to widen our scope. We need to look at the graph of human history not in thousands of years, but in millions. If you were to plot the cranial capacity of our lineage on a chart, the line would look like the stock price of a tech company that just invented the internet. For over 2 million years, the trend was directional, aggressive, and seemingly unstoppable. It was a single, sustained explosion of growth. Let's rewind the tape to the very beginning. Picture the sun rising over the African savanna 3 million years ago. Standing there, peering over the tall grass, is Australopithecus. These are the creatures that walked the walk but didn't quite talk the talk. If you looked inside their skulls, you'd find a brain roughly the size of a grapefruit, about 450 cubic centimeters. It was a modest engine, sufficient for a life of gathering fruit, avoiding leopards, and sleeping in trees. It was the biological baseline. But the Pleistocene epoch was not a time for baselines. It was a grinder. The climate fluctuated wildly, shifting from lush, wet periods to arid droughts that turned forests into dust bowls. To survive, you couldn't just react to the world, you had to predict it. And so, the arms race began. Nature began to select for processing power with a ferocity that is rare in evolutionary history. By the time Homo habilis, the handy man, arrived on the scene, the average brain size had surged to between 600 and 800 cubic centimeters. These were the first true tool makers, creatures who could look at a rock and see a knife hidden inside it. But the expansion didn't stop there. Next came Homo erectus, the traveler, the fire starter. Their brains averaged around 1,000 cubic centimeters. This was a threshold moment. With a liter of neural tissue, Homo erectus was smart enough to leave Africa, spreading into the cold of Europe and the jungles of Asia. They weren't just animals anymore. They were problem solvers. For 2 million years, the message from the environment was clear: get smarter or get dead. Encephalization, the increase in brain size relative to body mass, became the primary currency of survival. Every extra neuron was a weapon against starvation. Every new synaptic connection was a shield against the cold. Shutterstock, come far. And just to prove that this wasn't a fluke specific to our direct ancestors, we have to look at our cousins. We often think of ourselves as the pinnacle of this process, but we weren't the only ones playing the game. In the freezing valleys of Europe, a parallel lineage was pushing the limits of biology even further. Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals. Pop culture likes to paint them as dim-witted brutes, but their skulls tell a different story. The Neanderthals were the heavyweights of the hominin world. While early Homo sapiens were boasting cranial capacities of 1,400 or 1,500 cubic centimeters, Neanderthals were frequently clocking in at 1,500 to 1,700 cubic centimeters. Their brains were, on average, larger than ours are today, and often larger than those of the Cro-Magnons we idolize. They were the ultimate realization of the Pleistocene strategy: massive bodies powered by massive computers. This is critical to understand because it shows that big brains were not just a quirk, they were the dominant trend for the entire genus Homo. Whether you were a Neanderthal in Germany or a Cro-Magnon in France, the winning strategy was to pack as much neural tissue into the skull as the neck muscles could support. Think about the investment that represents. In the wild, energy is everything. A calorie spent on building a brain is a calorie you can't spend on building muscle, fighting an infection, or nursing a child. Yet for thousands of generations, nature decided that the brain was worth the price. It was the most expensive item on the menu, and we ordered the double portion every single time. This trajectory culminated in the late Pleistocene. We reached the zenith of biological investment. We had evolved into creatures that carried 1,500 cubic centimeters supercomputers on our shoulders, capable of art, language, strategy, and abstract thought. We had won the arms race. And then, almost immediately after winning, we decided to sell off the prize. After 2 million years of more, the trend line suddenly snapped. The graph crashed. It is one of the most abrupt U-turns in the history of life. To understand why we would abandon such a successful strategy, we have to understand the true cost of that hardware, because as it turns out, being a genius is incredibly expensive. You have to ask yourself, what is the price of a thought? We tend to view intelligence as a disembodied thing, a ghost in the machine that exists purely in the realm of ideas. But biologically speaking, intelligence is heavy, wet, and incredibly expensive. To understand why the sudden reduction in brain size is so baffling, you first have to understand the sheer economic insanity of building a big brain in the first place. Your brain is a metabolic furnace. It represents only about 2% of your total body weight, yet it demands roughly 20% of your entire energy intake just to keep the lights on. Think about that exchange rate. It is extortionate. Every time an ancient hunter tracked a gazelle, 1 out of every 5 calories he earned from that kill had to be funneled directly upstairs just to maintain the hardware. It didn't matter if he was sleeping, staring at a fire, or solving a complex navigational problem. The tax remained the same. In a world where starvation was a constant companion, carrying an organ that burned energy like a bonfire was a massive liability. But the cost wasn't just measured in calories, it was measured in blood. The expansion of the human brain created one of the most dangerous biological conflicts in the history of mammals, the obstetrical dilemma. As our ancestors selected for larger and larger cranial capacities, they ran headlong into the constraints of the human pelvis. Walking upright requires a narrow, stable pelvis for efficient locomotion. But birthing a big-brained baby requires a wide, expansive pelvic outlet. These two evolutionary imperatives were at war with each other. Nature's solution was a compromise, but it was a brutal one. To fit the massive head through the birth canal, human infants had to be born prematurely compared to other primates. A baby chimp is born with a brain that is already 40% of its adult size. A human baby is born with a brain that is only about 25% developed. We enter the world helpless, soft-skulled, and entirely dependent on our parents for years, simply because if we stayed in the womb any longer, our heads would kill our mothers on the way out. For hundreds of thousands of years, childbirth was the single greatest risk to the survival of adult females. Every millimeter of brain expansion increased that risk. Every upward tick on the graph of cranial capacity was paid for by the lives of women and infants who didn't survive the ordeal. Getty Images. This is why the Holocene Reversal is such a shock. Evolution is a ruthless optimizer. It does not tolerate inefficiency. If a trait is too expensive or too dangerous, it gets cut. For 2 million years, the selective pressure to be smarter was so overwhelming that it overruled the metabolic costs and the obstetrical dangers. The advantages of being able to track weather patterns, coordinate a hunt, and remember the medicinal properties of plants were so immense that nature was willing to pay any price to secure them. The sheer momentum of this process cannot be overstated. We were pushing the biological envelope to its absolute breaking point. By the late Pleistocene, we had evolved into what was essentially a walking life support system for a giant brain. We were the Ferraris of the hominin world, high performance, high maintenance, and built for speed of thought. Standing there in the Ice Age, looking at those Cro-Magnon hunters with their 1,500 cubic centimeter skulls, you are looking at the result of this high-stakes gamble. They were the winners. They had paid the costs, survived the births, and fed the furnace. They represented the zenith of biological investment in neural tissue. And then, in the blink of a geological eye, the market crashed. The trajectory that had held steady for 2 million years didn't just flatten. It nosedived. The investment strategy that had defined our genus, spend energy to gain intelligence, was suddenly abandoned. It's as if nature looked at the Cro-Magnon model, with its massive fuel requirements and dangerous design specs, and said, "This is no longer sustainable. We need to downsize. Something profound must have changed in the equation of human survival. The profit of having a massive brain must have suddenly stopped outweighing the cost of maintaining it." But what? What force is powerful enough to tell evolution to stop building a better computer? To find out, we have to look at the alibi. We have to look at the moment the shrinking started. And this is where the detective story gets messy, because the when is just as controversial as the why. Wait a minute, you might be whispering to yourself in the dark. Is this really a mystery? Or is it just simple geometry? It is the most natural objection in the world. You've seen the variation in human bodies just walking down the street. You know that a linebacker in the NFL is physically larger than a jockey at the Kentucky Derby. And consequently, the linebacker probably has a physically larger skull. It doesn't mean the jockey is less intelligent. It just means he is a smaller package. So the skeptic in you asks a very sensible question. Did our brains shrink simply because we shrank? This is called the null hypothesis. It suggests that there is no spooky evolutionary force targeting our intelligence. Instead, the story goes like this. The Ice Age ended, the world got warmer, and the selective pressure to be massive, heat-retaining giants evaporated. We got shorter, our bones got thinner, and we lost the heavy musculature of the mammoth hunters. Naturally, as our bodies scaled down, our brains scaled down with them. If you shrink a car, you have to shrink the engine to fit under the hood. If this hypothesis were true, the reduction in brain size would be isometric. That's a fancy biological term, meaning it scales perfectly with body size. If your body mass drops by 10% and your brain mass drops by 10%, your relative brain size hasn't actually changed. You haven't lost any computing power relative to your hardware. You've just become a compact model. For a long time, this was a comforting explanation. It allowed us to sleep at night, believing that we were still just as brainy as our ancestors, just in a more efficient chassis. But the math doesn't work. When researchers like Christopher Ruff and later Jeremy De Silva and ancient brain expert Jeff Steibel crunched the numbers, they found something disturbing. The reduction in human brain size during the Holocene is not isometric. It is allometric. Here is the difference. Imagine you have a luxury SUV with a massive V8 engine. You decide to trade it in for a smaller sedan. If the scaling were isometric, you'd get a sedan with a V6 engine. Smaller car, proportionally smaller engine. But that's not what happened to us. We traded in the SUV, and we drove off the lot in a sedan powered by a lawnmower engine. The data shows that while human body mass did indeed decrease after the Ice Age, our brain mass decreased more than can be explained by body size alone. The shrinkage of the brain outpaced the shrinkage of the body. This is measured by something called the encephalization quotient, or EQ. It's a number that tells you how big a species' brain is compared to what you would expect for an animal of that size. For millions of years, the human EQ was climbing. We were constantly punching above our weight class. But in the Holocene, for the first time, our EQ dropped. This is the smoking gun. It means that the loss of brain tissue wasn't just a passive side effect of getting shorter. It was an active, specific selection against the brain itself. Nature didn't just want smaller humans, it specifically wanted humans with less expensive neural tissue. This destroys the "we just got smaller" defense. It forces us to confront the reality that there was a specific penalty for maintaining a large brain in the post-Pleistocene world. The expensive tissue was being targeted. So, if it wasn't just body size, what was it? What happened to humanity that made a large brain a liability? To answer that, we have to look at the crime scene. We have to pinpoint exactly when the reduction started. And this is where the scientific community splits into two warring camps, locked in a fierce debate over a difference of 7,000 years. In any cold case investigation, establishing the timeline is the difference between solving the crime and chasing a ghost. If you find a body, knowing whether death occurred yesterday or 10 years ago completely changes your list of suspects. And in the case of the shrinking human brain, the when is just as volatile as the why. Determining exactly when the reduction began is the key to unlocking the mechanism behind it. If the brain started shrinking 10,000 years ago, the prime suspect is the environment, the shifting climate and the radical change in diet that came with farming. But if the brain started shrinking only 3,000 years ago, the suspect list changes dramatically. You are no longer looking at wheat and weather. You are looking at libraries, armies, and cities. You are looking at civilization itself. This question has torn the anthropological community into two distinct, warring camps. It is a chronological schism that defines the current debate. On one side, you have the deep Holocene view. This is the traditional consensus, the old guard. It aligns the reduction with the end of the Pleistocene, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. This timeline feels neat and tidy. It places the blame squarely on the shoulders of the Neolithic Revolution, the single biggest lifestyle shift in human history. It suggests that as soon as we put down the spear and picked up the plow, our biology began to soften. The glaciers retreated, the mammoths died, and we settled into a warmer, easier, and perhaps physically lesser existence. On the other side, you have the recent social view, a provocative new hypothesis championed by researchers like Jeremy De Silva and James Traniello. They argue that the timeline is much shorter. Using advanced statistical modeling on large datasets of skulls, they claim that human brain size remained relatively stable through the early days of farming and only began to plummet around 3,000 years ago, roughly 1000 BCE. Think about what was happening 3,000 years ago. We weren't just struggling farmers anymore. This was the era of the Great Bronze Age collapses and the rise of Iron Age empires. It was the time of the Zhou dynasty in China, the New Kingdom in Egypt, and the spread of complex writing systems. It was the birth of true collective intelligence. If the De Silva hypothesis is right, it implies something unsettling. That civilization and individual intelligence might be inversely correlated. It suggests that the safer and more connected our societies became, the less we needed our individual biological computers. So, we have two timelines and two very different stories about what it means to be human. Did we shrink because we got hungry and lazy at the end of the Ice Age? Or did we shrink because we became cogs in a social machine? To find the truth, we have to interrogate the suspects one by one. We have to start with the older, more established theory. We have to go back to the moment the ice melted and the first seeds were sown. We need to look at the agricultural revolution not as a triumph of progress, but as a biological trauma. The standard version of history, the one you learned in school, tells us that the end of the Ice Age was a graduation party for humanity. About 12,000 years ago, the glaciers that had strangled the northern hemisphere began to retreat. The climate stabilized, the world got wetter and warmer, and the vast, freezing steppes turned into lush grasslands and forests. For the first time in millennia, the planet wasn't trying to kill us with cold. According to the deep Holocene theorists, this moment, the glorious dawn of the Neolithic, is precisely when we started to lose our edge. This school of thought, supported by data from researchers like Henneberg, argues that the brain didn't shrink because of some sudden social event in the Iron Age. It shrank because the fundamental biological contract of our existence changed the moment we planted the first seed. Henneberg's analysis of cranial datasets shows a gradual, continuous decline starting right there in the Mesolithic, the transition period, and accelerating as we moved fully into the farming lifestyle. Think about the shift in daily reality. For 100,000 years, your ancestors were mobile, aggressive foragers. They were the apex predators of a hostile world. But when the climate warmed, we made a trade. We traded the uncertainty of the hunt for the stability of the harvest. We stopped moving. We built permanent villages, then towns. We domesticated animals and fenced off land. In doing so, we created what anthropologists call a permissive environment. The intense, unforgiving, selective pressures of the Pleistocene evaporated. In the Ice Age, if you weren't smart enough to track a mammoth through a blizzard, you died. In the Neolithic village, if you weren't the sharpest tool in the shed, you could still probably survive. You could lean on the surplus food stored in the granary. You could rely on the walls your neighbors built. The penalty for individual cognitive failure became less severe. Nature stopped culling the average minds with such ruthless efficiency. But there was a darker side to this permissiveness, and it had to do with fuel. The agricultural transition is often sold to us as a leap forward in food security, but biologically, it was a nutritional disaster. The hunter-gatherer diet was spectacular, a diverse mix of high-quality wild proteins, nutrient-dense fats, and hundreds of different plant species. It was rocket fuel for a high-performance brain. The early farmer's diet, by contrast, was monotonous and weak. It was dominated by a handful of cereal crops: wheat, barley, rice, maize. These provided plenty of empty calories to keep you alive, but they were critically low in the vitamins, minerals, and essential fatty acids required to build and maintain a massive, complex nervous system. We effectively switched from a paleo diet of steak and salad to a diet of gruel and bread. In this context, the large brain of the Cro-Magnon became a liability. A 1,500 cubic centimeter brain demands a high-octane fuel source. If you try to run a Ferrari on low-grade lawnmower gas, the engine knocks, stutters, and eventually fails. Faced with a population that was suddenly surviving on carbohydrate-heavy, protein-poor sludge, nature may have had no choice but to downsize the engine. A smaller brain is cheaper to build and easier to fuel. In a world of nutritional scarcity, the 1,350 cubic centimeters brain wasn't worse. It was the only one that could run on the fuel available. So, under this theory, the reduction wasn't a sign of civilization making us dumb. It was a sign of agriculture making us malnourished. But the diet wasn't the only thing changing our faces. As we switched from chewing tough, dried meats to slurping soft porridges, the physical machinery of our heads began to dismantle itself. There is a saying that you are what you eat, but in evolutionary biology, it is more accurate to say that you look like how you eat. And if we want to understand why your skull is so much more delicate than your ancestors, we have to talk about the physical act of chewing. It seems trivial, doesn't it? You probably don't think of your jaw as a piece of heavy machinery. But for the vast majority of human history, the mouth was the primary tool for interacting with the world. Imagine the dinner menu of a Pleistocene hunter. We aren't talking about a tenderized steak from a supermarket. We are talking about game meat that is tough, fibrous, and often dried into jerky to last through the winter. We are talking about wild tubers and roots that are covered in grit and as hard as wood. To extract calories from this diet, you didn't just eat. You went to war with your food. A Cro-Magnon meal required immense sustained bite force. It demanded hours of repetitive high-stress grinding. And this is where a fundamental law of biology comes into play. Bone is not dead stone. It is living tissue that reacts to stress. If you lift heavy weights, your bones thicken to support the muscle. If you chew rocks, your jaw grows into a fortress. The skulls of our ancestors were built to withstand this hydraulic pressure. They possessed broad, thick mandibles, jaws that could crack a bone to get at the marrow inside. But more importantly, they had massive anchor points for the muscles that drove those jaws. Now, fast forward to the Neolithic Revolution. When we switched to farming, we didn't just change the nutritional content of our food, we changed its texture. We invented the soft diet. We started boiling grains into porridges. We started fermenting foods. We started baking soft breads and stewing meats until they fell off the bone. Suddenly, the hydraulic press in our mouths was out of a job. The masticatory functional hypothesis suggests that this shift in diet triggered a domino effect that reshaped the entire human head. It started with the mandible. Because children grew up eating soft, processed mush, the mechanical stress on their developing jaws plummeted. The body, efficient as always, stopped investing in heavy jawbones. The mandible shrank, becoming the narrower, more recessed chin you see in the mirror today. But the reduction didn't stop at the chin. It traveled up. Place your fingers on your temples right above your ears and clench your teeth. You feel that muscle bulging? That is the temporalis muscle. It is one of the primary engines of chewing. In you, it is a modest strip of tissue. In a late Pleistocene hunter, it was a thick, powerful fan of muscle that reached high up onto the sides of the cranium. These massive muscles acted like a structural helmet. To support the force they generated, the skull walls had to be thick and reinforced. The cranium had to be robust just to keep from buckling under the pressure of its own jaw. When the agricultural diet weakened the jaw, the temporalis muscle shrank. And when the muscle shrank, the skull walls no longer needed to be fortress thick. They gracilized. The bone became thinner, lighter, and smoother. This is where the shrinking brain gets complicated. Part of the volume we lost might not be brain at all. It might be the structural scaffolding that was holding the brain safe while we chewed through bison tendons. We became more gracile, a polite anthropological term for delicate. So the reduction in cranial capacity correlates with this generalized gracilization. We didn't just lose volume, we lost the heavy-duty armor that defined our species for 2 million years. We traded the face of a wolf for the face of a pug, all because we learned how to make oatmeal. But this structural remodeling didn't just make our faces smaller. It changed the very shape of the container. And that shape change might be hiding the biggest clue of all. Keep your fingers on your temples for a moment longer. I want you to visualize exactly what is happening beneath the skin. That muscle you feel pulsing when you clench your jaw, the temporalis, is just a shadow of what it used to be. In a Cro-Magnon, That muscle fan didn't just stop at the temple. It swept wide and high, anchoring itself aggressively to the parietal bones of the skull. Think of this muscle as a biological helmet. For hundreds of thousands of years, the sheer tension of the temporalis acted as a structural constraint on the shape of the human head. The skull couldn't just expand in any direction it wanted. It had to withstand the constant, rhythmic crushing force of chewing. To prevent the cranium from warping or cracking under this stress, the bone had to be reinforced. It had to be thick, dense, and buttressed by heavy ridges, particularly around the brow and the midline. But when the agricultural diet softened our food, that helmet was unbuckled. As the temporalis muscle shrank from lack of use, the tension on the skull bones relaxed. The thick, bony anchors were no longer necessary. The heavy brow ridges, which acted like the frame of a pair of safety goggles to distribute stress, began to fade away. The skull walls thinned out. This is where the geometry gets interesting. Without the heavy muscle band strapping it down, the human cranium underwent a subtle but profound remodeling. It shifted from being elongated, like a rugby ball or an American football, to being globular, like a soccer ball. This process, known as globularization, is one of the defining traits of modern humans. If you look at a Neanderthal skull, it is long and low, with a bun at the back. It looks like a high-speed train. Your skull, by contrast, is a high-domed sphere. This shape change is critical to the mystery of the missing volume. A sphere is the most mathematically efficient shape for holding volume with the least amount of surface area. By rounding out the skull, nature might have been able to pack the neural machinery more tightly. We lost the dead space required by the elongated, heavy bone architecture of the past. So, part of the 150 cubic centimeters reduction might simply be a result of this structural cleanup. We didn't necessarily lose thinking parts. We lost the heavy scaffolding that was holding the thinking parts in place. But this remodeling did more than just change the shape of your head. It changed the face looking back at you in the mirror. As the jaw shrank and the skull rounded, humanity underwent a process of feminization, or neoteny, the retention of juvenile traits. We started to look more like the children of our ancestors than the adults. We lost the jutting, muzzle-like prognathism of the Pleistocene hunters. Our teeth became crowded because the jaw shrank faster than the teeth did, a problem your orthodontist is still billing you for today. We became a species of baby faces, soft chins, high foreheads, small jaws. It's a less intimidating look, certainly, but it raises a disturbing question. Did we just become cuter and more efficient? Or is this physical softening a symptom of a deeper biological frailty? Because while the structural remodeling theory explains the shape, it doesn't fully explain the cost. You don't dump 15% of your brain just because you stopped chewing beef jerky. There had to be an energy crisis. And that crisis, ironically, came from the very thing that was supposed to save us: the farm. To understand the energy crisis that hit your ancestors, we have to look at one of the most famous ideas in evolutionary biology, the expensive tissue hypothesis. Proposed by Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler, this theory explains how we managed to afford such a massive brain in the first place. The logic is simple. The body has two major energy hogs, the brain and the gut. Both are metabolically expensive tissues that require constant fuel. You can't have a massive, complex digestive tract and a massive, complex brain. The energy budget just isn't big enough. So, for 2 million years, our ancestors struck a deal. They shortened their guts. They moved away from the low-quality, fibrous vegetation that chimps eat, which requires a huge fermentation tank of a stomach, and switched to high-quality nutrient-dense foods like meat, marrow, and cooked tubers. By eating better food, we could afford to have a smaller digestive system, freeing up the metabolic surplus to build a bigger brain. We essentially traded intestine for intellect. But when the Holocene arrived and we adopted agriculture, we broke the deal. We tend to think of the invention of farming as the moment humanity secured its food supply. We picture abundant fields of waving wheat and overflowing granaries. But the skeletal record tells a much grimmer story. The transition to agriculture was, at least initially, a nutritional disaster. While farming provided a reliable source of calories, those calories were terrible. We went from the diverse, protein-rich buffet of the hunter-gatherer to a mono diet of carbohydrates. We lost the vitamins, the minerals, and the essential fatty acids that wild foods provided, and the body noticed. When you look at the skeletons of early Neolithic farmers, you see widespread evidence of chronic stress. They were significantly shorter than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Their bones were weaker. And most damning of all, their teeth are often scarred by something called enamel hyperplasia. These are horizontal lines on the teeth that form when a child is so malnourished or so sick that the body literally stops producing enamel for a period of time. It is a biological record of starvation. In this state of chronic nutritional deficiency, the expensive tissue equation flipped. The body was no longer swimming in high-quality energy. It was barely scraping by. And when a biological system is under budget pressure, it cuts the luxury items first. The brain, that voracious 1,500 cubic centimeters furnace, was suddenly a liability. It was an energy sink that the new carb-heavy diet couldn't support. So, the body made a ruthless calculation. It is better to be slightly less intelligent and alive than a genius who starves to death. Evolution began to select against the largest brains. The individuals with the massive, expensive neural engines were more likely to succumb to the nutritional stress of the early farm. The survivors were the ones with more modest metabolic needs, the ones with the 1,350 cubic centimeter brains. They were the economy models, capable of running on the lower-grade fuel that agriculture provided. This theory suggests that the reduction in our brain size wasn't an upgrade. It was a recession measure. We didn't shrink because we didn't need the intelligence. We shrank because we couldn't afford it anymore. We were like a civilization that forgot how to build nuclear reactors and had to go back to burning coal. But malnutrition wasn't the only thing stripping away our mass. While our internal engines were downsizing to match our diet, the external world was changing too. The very air around us was warming up, and that brought a whole new set of laws into play. Laws that govern the relationship between heat, size, and survival. While the nutritional collapse of the early farm offers a compelling economic reason for our downsizing, we cannot ignore the temperature of the room. The stage upon which this entire drama played out was undergoing a radical shift in lighting and temperature. We moved from the freezer into the greenhouse. To understand how the weather shapes your skull, you have to understand a fundamental law of ecological physics known as Bergmann's rule. Named after the 19th century German biologist Carl Bergmann, this rule observes a simple pattern in nature. Populations of a species living in colder climates tend to be larger and heavier than those living in warmer climates. You see this in bears. The massive polar bear lives in the Arctic, while the much smaller sun bear lives in the tropics. You see it in deer, in wolves, and, as it turns out, in humans. The physics behind this is all about heat retention. Imagine a large cube and a small cube. The large cube has a much lower surface area to volume ratio. This means it has a lot of insides generating heat and relatively less skin to lose that heat to the freezing air. Being big is a biological insulation strategy. It keeps the core warm. Conversely, if you live in a hot climate, being massive is a death sentence. You can't shed heat fast enough. You overheat and collapse. In the heat, you want to be long, lean, and slight, like a radiator, to maximize the surface area available for cooling. For tens of thousands of years, our ancestors were living in the Pleistocene Ice Age. The world was a refrigerator. To survive, the human body adapted by becoming massive. The Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals were not just strong, they were dense. They had wide torsos, short limbs, and heavy bones. They were built to hoard every calorie of heat their metabolism produced. And because they had massive bodies, they needed massive brains to run them. This is the simple scaling law we discussed earlier. A bigger ship needs a bigger rudder. But 10,000 years ago, the thermostat broke. The Earth entered the Holocene interglacial period. The ice sheets that covered Chicago and London melted away. The global temperature spiked. Suddenly, the selective pressure to be a heat-retaining giant didn't just vanish, it reversed. In this new, warmer world, the massive, stocky build of the Ice Age hunter was no longer an asset. It was an energetic burden. It was like wearing a parka on a beach. So, humanity began to shed weight. Over thousands of years, we became shorter, leaner, and less robust. We morphed from the polar bear model of the human to the sun bear model. And as our bodies shrank in accordance with Bergman's rule, our brains followed suit. This offers a very tidy, very physical explanation for the shrinking brain. It suggests that we didn't get dumber, we just got hotter. We adapted to a world that no longer required us to be biological furnaces. However, we have to be careful not to give the weather too much credit. While climate explains the reduction in body mass perfectly, remember the allometric problem we uncovered earlier. The brain shrank more than the body did. If this were purely a case of heat adaptation, the brain should have scaled down in perfect lockstep with the body. But it didn't. It plummeted. So while the warming world certainly helped grease the skids for reduction, making it physically easier to be smaller, it is not the whole story. The climate provided the opportunity, but it wasn't the sole executioner. We are left with a picture of the deep Holocene explanation that is robust but incomplete. We have the motive, energy efficiency in a starving, warming world. We have the weapon, the nutritional stress of agriculture and the physics of heat loss. But there is still a nagging doubt. This explanation works well for the 10,000-year timeline. It fits the data for the early farmers perfectly. But it doesn't quite account for the strange acceleration of brain loss that some researchers see much later in the record. It doesn't explain why indigenous Australians, who didn't adopt the starving agricultural lifestyle, also saw their brains shrink. And it doesn't explain why the reduction seems to track so closely with the rise of something that has nothing to do with calories or climate. The rise of the city. This brings us to the edge of the second timeline. We are done with the farmers. Now we have to talk about the scribes. We have to leave the muddy fields of the Neolithic and walk into the stone streets of the first empires. So, let's take a moment to look at the case we've built so far. It's a solid, pragmatic argument. It suggests that the shrinking of the human brain was essentially a physiological accident, a side effect of the way we changed our environment. The deep Holocene verdict goes like this. Around 10,000 years ago, the ice melted. and we got warm. That triggered Bergman's rule, shrinking our bodies to shed heat. At the same time, we switched to farming, which ruined our diet and starved our developing brains of high-quality fuel. And finally, we started eating soft mush, which caused our jaws and skulls to grassalize and remodel into smaller, rounder shapes. It's a neat package. It ties everything to the Neolithic Revolution, that great turning point where humanity traded freedom for security. It paints a picture of a species that was physically diminished by its own success. We survived, but we did so as smaller, weaker, and structurally more delicate versions of our ancestors. But if you stare at this explanation long enough, cracks start to appear. It feels insufficient. The primary problem is the universality of the signal. Remember, agriculture didn't happen everywhere at once. It was a patchy, staggered process. It started in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 years ago, but it didn't reach parts of Europe for thousands of years. It appeared independently in China and the Americas at completely different times. And vast swathes of the planet, like Australia, the Arctic, and the American plains, remained the domain of hunter-gatherers long into the modern era. If the shrink was purely a result of eating grain and living in a farmhouse, then the shrinkage should track perfectly with the arrival of the plow. The brain reduction in China should happen thousands of years after the reduction in Mesopotamia. The hunter-gatherers in Australia should have retained their massive Pleistocene brains right up until the moment colonization forced them into a different lifestyle. But that is not what the bone record shows. While there is regional variation, the trend of reduction seems to be a global hum, a background frequency that affected humanity as a collective species. The indigenous Australians, who never stopped chewing tough foods and never switched to a monoculture carbohydrate diet, still experienced grassalization and cranial reduction in the Holocene. This anomaly suggests that while diet and climate were certainly part of the equation, they were not the whole equation. There is a missing variable. Something else was exerting a downward pressure on our neural tissue, something that transcended the specific menu of a specific tribe. And then there is the cognitive question. The deep Holocene theory treats the brain like a muscle. It implies that because life got easier and less physically demanding, the brain just atrophied from disuse. But did life really get easier? Sure, we stopped tracking mammoths, but we started building irrigation systems. We started navigating complex social hierarchies in villages of hundreds, then thousands of people. We started encoding laws, creating art, and laying the foundations of mathematics. The cognitive load of the Holocene didn't disappear. It shifted. It moved from ecological intelligence, how to read the woods, to social intelligence, how to read your neighbor. Does it really make sense that the moment we started building civilization, the most cognitively complex project in the history of life, was the exact moment nature decided we needed less brain power? This nagging doubt is what opened the door for a radical new theory. It is a theory that challenges the timeline, the cause, and the very definition of what it means to be smart. It argues that the deep Holocene view is looking at the wrong crime scene. It suggests that the real crash didn't happen when we planted the first seed 10,000 years ago. It happened much, much later. It happened when we started to read. In 2021, a team of researchers decided to throw a hand grenade into the timeline. Led by Jeremy De Silva and James Traniello, these scientists weren't satisfied with the gradual decline narrative. They looked at the data and felt that the smooth, slow slope of the 10,000-year theory was masking something much more abrupt. So, they conducted a study that would spark one of the fiercest debates in modern anthropology. De Silva and his colleagues gathered a dataset of 985 crania, covering a massive span of human history. Instead of just looking for a general trend line, they applied a specific statistical technique called change-point analysis. Think of this as an algorithm designed to find the knee in a curve, the exact moment where a stable system suddenly breaks. They weren't looking for a slope. They were looking for a cliff. And according to their analysis, they found one. Their model suggested that human brain size didn't start shrinking 10,000 years ago when the ice melted. It argued that brain size remained relatively stable through the early Holocene, through the initial domestication of plants and animals, and through the early Neolithic. The big brain of the Pleistocene held its ground for thousands of years longer than we thought. Then, at a specific point in history, the floor fell out. The change-point analysis identified a distinct break point at almost exactly 3,000 years ago. I want you to pause and consider that date. 3000 BP. That is roughly 1000 BCE. We are not talking about cavemen. We are not talking about the first frightened farmers figuring out how to plant wheat. By 1000 BCE, humanity was already deep into the game of civilization. This was the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. The Great Pyramids of Giza had already been standing for 1,500 years. The Vedic period was in full swing in India. The Olmec civilization was thriving in Mexico. The Zhou dynasty was establishing its mandate in China. This was the era of the first true empires. It was the era of complex, stratified urban centers where tens of thousands of people lived in close proximity. It was the era of widespread trade networks, professional armies, and, crucially, the spread of literacy and external information storage. The De Silva hypothesis suggests that this, the rise of complex society itself, was the trigger. The argument is that for the first time in history, humans began to live in social structures so sophisticated that they effectively socialized the need for intelligence. You no longer needed to be a survivalist genius to stay alive because the state, or the city, was doing the heavy lifting for you. The collective intelligence of the group began to supersede the individual intelligence of the citizen. It's a chilling thought. It implies that the moment we built a world safe enough to support millions of people, nature looked at our expensive, energy-hungry brains and said, "You don't need all that anymore." This theory, which links the reduction directly to the rise of collective intelligence and networks, reframes the entire phenomenon. It stops being about diet and climate and starts being about information. It suggests we became cogs in a machine, and cogs don't need to be as smart as the engineer. However, as you might expect, rewriting the history of human evolution isn't that simple. When De Silva published this timeline, the scientific community didn't just nod in agreement. They fought back. Because if the brain really did crash 3,000 years ago, it overturns everything we thought we knew about the value of the human mind. Of course, when you drop a bomb like that into the middle of a crowded academic field, you have to expect some shrapnel. And the 3,000-year cliff hypothesis did not go unchallenged. In fact, it was almost immediately met with a barrage of statistical artillery fire. In 2022, just a year after De Silva's study made headlines, a pair of researchers named Brian Villemore and Mark Grabowski published a stinging refutation. They didn't just disagree with the interpretation, they attacked the data itself. Their argument was simple. The cliff wasn't a biological reality. It was a statistical illusion created by a messy data set. Villemore and Grabowski pointed out a critical flaw in the numbers. They highlighted that the data set of 985 skulls was heavily unbalanced. Imagine trying to conduct a political poll where you interview 10 people from the 19th century and 5,000 people from last Tuesday. Your results are going to be skewed. The critics noted that over half of the skulls in the De Silva study represented the last 100 years, while the critical time window, that mysterious period between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago, was represented by only 23 specimens. Basing a grand theory of human evolution on just 23 skulls is, to put it mildly, risky. But the critique went deeper. They also accused the study of lumping geography. The dataset combined populations from all over the world into a single graph. It mixed ancient Chinese skulls with modern English ones and African Iron Age specimens with European medieval ones. This is a problem because, as we know, human cranial capacity varies naturally by latitude and population history. If your ancient sample is mostly from cold northern Europe, where heads are big, and your modern sample is mostly from warmer regions or different populations, the graph will show a shrinkage that isn't actually happening. You aren't measuring evolution. You're just measuring the difference between a Viking and a Roman. When Villemare and Grabowski reanalyzed the data using a more rigorous sorting method, excluding outliers and grouping populations more carefully, they claimed the cliff disappeared. They argued that human brain size has been remarkably stable for the last 30,000 years, and that the reduction is just a ghost in the machine. So, is the mystery solved? Is the case closed? Not quite. Science is rarely a clean knockout. De Silva and his team fired back in 2023. They acknowledged the messiness of the large datasets, but pointed out that they weren't the only ones seeing the trend. They cited foundational studies from the 1980s, like those by Henneberg and Beals, which used different datasets and still found a significant reduction. De Silva's defense was essentially this. You can argue about the exact date of the crash. Maybe it was a sharp drop at 3,000 years, or maybe it was a steeper slide starting at 10,000 years. But you cannot argue away the missing volume. The fact remains that modern humans, on average, have smaller cranial capacities than their late Pleistocene ancestors. Whether the graph is a cliff or a slope, the destination is the same. We are smaller. This back and forth leaves us in an interesting position. The specific date of 3,000 years ago might be a statistical exaggeration, a proxy for peak social complexity, but the underlying correlation is hard to shake. The biological signal for reduction seems to intensify as societies get more complex. And this is where the debate becomes truly fascinating. Because even if the when is fuzzy, the why proposed by the De Silva team is one of the most provocative ideas in the history of anthropology. It suggests that we didn't just shrink because of diet or climate. It suggests we shrank because we stopped being individuals and started being a collective. To understand this, we have to stop looking at humans as isolated hunters and start looking at us as nodes in a network. We have to explore the collective intelligence hypothesis, and to do that, we have to look for a model. We need to find another creature on Earth that builds cities, fights wars, farms crops, and lives in societies of millions. We need to look at the ants. The theory that emerged from the wreckage of that timeline debate is called the collective intelligence hypothesis, and it offers a profoundly different way of looking at human brilliance. It suggests that the reduction in brain size isn't a sign of failure. It is a sign of optimization. It argues that for the last few thousand years, we have been busy offloading the heavy lifting of survival from our own skulls into the mind of the society we built. To understand this, we have to look at the concept of distributed cognition. This is the idea that knowledge doesn't just live in a single brain, it lives in the connections between people. Think back to that Cro-Magnon hunter we met on the ridge. He was a generalist. He had to be. There was no one else to rely on. If he didn't know the migration patterns of the reindeer, the medicinal properties of willow bark, the tensile strength of sinew, and the geography of the entire valley, he died. He was a walking encyclopedia of the Pleistocene. His brain had to be massive because it was a standalone hard drive containing the entire operating system for human survival. Now, look at your own life. You are likely a hyper-specialist. You might be incredibly good at coding in Python, or fixing diesel engines, or baking sourdough bread. But do you know how to smelt bronze? Do you know how to set a broken femur? Do you know which mushrooms in your backyard will kill you? You don't need to know these things. You don't need to store that data in your neocortex because the group knows it for you. If you break your leg, you go to a specialist who knows bones. If you are hungry, you go to a specialist who grows food. If you need a tool, you buy it from a specialist who manufactures it. With the advent of agriculture 10,000 years ago and the explosion of urbanization 3,000 years ago, humanity transitioned into a state where survival no longer required every individual to be a genius. Society diversified. Farmers farmed, soldiers fought, scribes wrote, and priests prayed. The cognitive load was shattered into thousands of tiny fragments and distributed across the population. But we didn't just share the load with each other, we shared it with our environment. We invented external storage. When our ancestors started painting on walls, and later when they started pressing wedges into wet clay to create writing, they were performing a radical biological act. They were taking information out of their biological tissue and storing it in stone and ceramic. We created a cognitive scaffold, a library of knowledge that existed outside of our bodies. We no longer needed to memorize the history of our people, we could just read it. The collective intelligence hypothesis argues that this externalization made the massive, energy-expensive brain of the Pleistocene obsolete. Why pay the metabolic cost for a 1,500 cubic centimeter brain when a 1,350 cubic centimeter brain connected to a library and a functioning society can achieve superior results? We became nodes in a supercomputer. We traded raw, individual processing power for connectivity. This sounds like a lovely metaphor, humans as a networked superorganism. But for biologists, metaphors aren't enough. They need proof. They need a model. To verify this hypothesis, researchers realized they needed to find another creature that had followed the same evolutionary path. They needed to find an animal that lives in massive, complex societies, divides labor among specialists, and builds cities. And as it turns out, the best place to look wasn't in the primate house. It was under the dirt. It feels almost insulting, doesn't it? You are a complex, emotional human being capable of love, philosophy, and calculus. To suggest that the best biological model for your society is a six-legged insect scurrying across a kitchen counter seems like a joke. But when researchers like James Traniello began hunting for a way to explain the shrinking human brain, they realized that looking at other primates was a dead end. Chimpanzees are smart, yes, but they don't live in cities. They don't have economies. They don't have standing armies, sewage systems, or agriculture. They live in small, loose troops where every individual is essentially doing the same thing. If you want to understand what happens to a brain when it is plugged into a massive, hypercomplex civilization, you have to look at the only other creatures on Earth that have actually built one, the eusocial insects. Ants and humans are the two dominant superorganisms of this planet. We are the only two lineages that have managed to conquer the globe by replacing the individual with the colony. Just like us, ants practice agriculture. They farm fungus and herd aphids like cattle. Just like us, they build climate-controlled megastructures that can house millions of individuals. Just like us, they wage organized wars of annihilation against their neighbors. And just like us, they have divided their labor so thoroughly that no single individual can survive on its own. This convergence makes the ant neurobiology lab the perfect place to test the collective intelligence hypothesis. The logic proposed by Traniello and his colleagues is that there is a fundamental trade-off between the intelligence of the group and the intelligence of the individual. In the solitary world of a spider or a beetle, the individual has to be smart. It has to process every sensory input and make every decision. But in the world of the ant, the colony acts as the cognitive unit. The wisdom of the crowd supersedes the wisdom of the worker. This offers a tantalizing explanation for the 3,000-year drop in human brain size. The theory posits that as human societies reached a tipping point of complexity around the time of the great ancient civilizations, we underwent a eusocial shift. We crossed the invisible line between being a troop of smart apes and being a hive of specialized citizens. If this model holds true, then we should see a biological signature in the ants themselves. We should be able to prove that as an ant species becomes more social and more complex, its individual workers become, biologically speaking, less brainy. We should expect to see that the most sophisticated colonies are run by the most streamlined components, and that is exactly what the data shows. When you zoom in on the neural architecture of the ant world, you find a stunning parallel to the human condition. You find that civilization, whether it is built of stone or dirt, allows the participants to turn down the voltage in their own heads. Let's step into the laboratory and look at two specific types of ants that tell this story perfectly. On one side of the glass, we have the common garden ant. These are the scrappy survivors you might find raiding your picnic basket. They live in relatively simple, loose colonies. They are the villagers of the insect world. On the other side of the glass, we have the weaver ants. These creatures are the Roman Empire of the undergrowth. They build massive, intricate nests in the tree canopy by stitching leaves together with living silk. To do this, they engage in a behavior that looks frighteningly like engineering. A team of workers will hold 2 leaves together, straining against the tension, while another worker gently squeezes a larva, a baby ant, like a tube of glue, using its silk to bind the edges. It is a stunning display of cooperation, communication, and collective foresight. If you were placing bets, you would put your money on the weaver ant having the more powerful brain. Their society is more complex, their architecture is superior, and their coordination is unmatched. You would assume their neurons are firing at maximum capacity to pull this off. But when researchers analyzed the metabolic activity in the brains of these two species, they found the exact opposite. They looked specifically at the mushroom bodies, the part of the insect brain responsible for learning, memory, and sensory integration. In the scrappy, less sophisticated garden ants, these regions were buzzing with energy, but in the highly sophisticated weaver ants, the metabolic markers were significantly lower. Their brains were running cool. It seems paradoxical, but it reveals a fundamental truth about social evolution. The weaver ants didn't need to burn as much energy individually because their social structure absorbed the cognitive load. They didn't need to be hyper-alert generalists because the colony itself provided the security and the direction. The high level of integration allowed the individual workers to be metabolically cheaper. Think of it like the difference between a survivalist living off the grid and a corporate accountant living in Manhattan. The survivalist has to be hyper-aware, constantly scanning for threats, calculating food rations, listening for changes in the weather. His brain is on high alert. The accountant, despite living in a far more complex nest, a city of millions with subways and skyscrapers, can afford to zone out on the train ride home. The complexity of the city actually allows the citizen to operate on autopilot. The weaver ant teaches us that social complexity doesn't require individual complexity. In fact, it often selects against it. But the story gets even darker when we look at the species that takes this specialization to its absolute limit. If the weaver ant is the Roman Empire, the next ant we need to meet is the factory worker of the Industrial Revolution. If the weaver ant is a citizen of Rome, the leafcutter ant is a worker on the assembly line of a dystopian sci-fi mega-corporation. These are the fungus-farming ants of the genus Atta, and specifically Atta cephalotes. You have likely seen footage of them in nature documentaries, long, mesmerizing lines of green creeping along the rainforest floor, each ant holding a cut section of leaf above its head like a sail. They are the ultimate agriculturalists of the insect world. They don't eat the leaves, they chew them into a pulp to grow a specialized fungus deep underground, which they then harvest for food. But what makes Atta so terrifyingly efficient is not their farming, it is their bodies. Unlike the weaver ants, who generally look similar to one another, leafcutter ants practice extreme polymorphism. They are born into rigid physical casts that determine their destiny from the moment they hatch. In a single colony, you will find minims, tiny, near-invisible gardeners who never leave the fungus chambers. You will find medius, the foragers who trek out into the jungle to cut the leaves. And you will find majors, massive, hulking soldiers with heads the size of boulders, designed solely for crushing the skulls of enemies. This isn't just a difference in body size, it is a difference in neural architecture. Research into the brains of these castes confirms a phenomenon known as mosaicism. It turns out that the brain of a leafcutter ant does not scale isometrically. A soldier is not just a scaled-up version of a gardener. Its brain is wired completely differently. The forager, who has to navigate the complex 3D environment of the rainforest, remember landmarks, and locate specific tree species, has a brain packed with sensory processing power. The soldier, despite having a massive head, has a relatively small brain in the areas that count for intelligence. It doesn't need to know how to find a tree. It doesn't need to know how to cultivate a fungus. It only needs to know how to bite the thing that smells like an enemy. In this system, the generalist is dead. The Renaissance man of the ant world has been replaced by a biological toolkit. The gardener is a genius at farming, but a moron at fighting. The soldier is a weapon of war, but would starve to death if asked to find its own dinner. This is the ultimate realization of the group-level cognition hypothesis. In these class-based societies, natural selection stops caring about the smartness of the individual ant. In fact, it actively selects against it. Why waste energy building a complex brain for a soldier when all you need is a pair of jaws and a trigger reflex? Why give a gardener a navigational cortex when it will spend its entire life in the dark? The collective knowledge of the group, where the food is, how to grow it, how to defend it, buffers the individual from the need to know anything outside its narrow job description. The colony is the genius. The ant is just a disposable low-energy subroutine. Now take this image, the tiny specialized gardener and the massive dumb soldier, and hold it in your mind. Because when we turn the mirror back on ourselves, on our modern cities and our global economy, the reflection looks uncomfortably familiar. Now, I want you to take that image of the specialized, mosaic-brained ant and overlay it onto your own world. It feels uncomfortable, doesn't it? We like to think of ourselves as independent agents, captains of our own souls. But the collective intelligence hypothesis argues that somewhere around 3,000 years ago, humanity crossed a threshold. We ceased to be a collection of isolated generalists and became a pseudo-eusocial species. We effectively became the leaf-cutter ants of the primate world. Consider the generalist Pleistocene hunter we left back on that frozen ridge. He was a master of everything. He had to be. If he didn't know how to nap a flint, how to suture a wound, how to identify edible tubers, and how to navigate by the stars, he simply didn't survive. His brain was a Swiss Army knife, packed with every tool imaginable because there was no one else to rely on. He was, by necessity, a high hardware processor. Now consider the specialist Holocene citizen. You! When the agricultural revolution took hold, around 10,000 years ago, and urbanization followed, around 3,000 years ago, the cognitive load of survival shifted. We shattered the job of staying alive into thousands of tiny, manageable fragments. You don't need to know how to build a shelter. You pay a carpenter or a construction firm. You don't need to know how to hunt. You pay a butcher. You don't need to know how to fight off a predator. You pay taxes to a police force and an army. You are free to specialize in something incredibly niche, like corporate law, graphic design, or, ironically, writing scripts about brain evolution. In this system, the pressure to maintain a massive, energy-expensive, generalist brain evaporates. In fact, it becomes wasteful. Why burn 20% of your calories powering a brain capable of solving every problem in the wilderness when you live in a climate-controlled box with a refrigerator full of food? The social brain has taken over. We exist within a cognitive scaffold that compensates for our individual deficits. This is the ultimate safety net. In the Pleistocene, a moment of stupidity meant death. In the modern world, you can be profoundly ignorant of basic survival skills. You can be unable to start a fire, unable to find water, unable to defend yourself. And yet, you can live a long, healthy, reproductive life. Society buffers you. It allows the average processing power to drop because the network itself is so strong. But we didn't just outsource our skills, we outsourced our memory. The De Silva hypothesis emphasizes the role of external storage. When we invented writing, and later the printing press, and finally the internet, we moved our hard drive outside of our skulls. The hunter-gatherer had to store the taxonomy of thousands of plants in his neocortex. You just have to store the ability to Google it. This is the distributed cognition at work. We have offloaded our software into the social cloud, allowing the biological hardware to shrink and become more efficient. It is a massive efficiency adaptation. We traded the raw, brute force processing power of the individual for the hyperconnectivity of the group. So, under this model, the 150 cubic centimeters of brain matter you are missing isn't lost intelligence. It is just space you cleared out because you uploaded those files to the civilization around you. You are a lighter, faster, more efficient node in a superorganism that is, collectively, smarter than any Cro-Magnon could ever dream of being. But there is a catch. This theory relies on the idea that we became social and cooperative enough to trust the group. And to become that cooperative, something else had to happen to us. We couldn't just decide to be nice. We had to be biologically rewired for it. We had to be tamed. And this brings us to the second major theory for the shrinking brain. It's a theory that shifts the focus from efficiency to personality. It suggests that the reason your brain is smaller is not because you are a specialist, but because you are a domesticated animal. The collective intelligence theory is flattering in its own way. It suggests that our brains got smaller because our society got smarter, that we are the efficient, networked nodes of a planetary supercomputer. It frames the reduction as a technological upgrade. But there is another theory, one that cuts much deeper into our sense of self. It suggests that the reason you have a smaller brain than a Cro-Magnon is not because you are a specialist, but because, biologically speaking, you are a pet. This is the self-domestication hypothesis, and it requires us to shift our gaze from the social world of ants to the developmental world of mammals. Championed by researchers like Brian Hare and Richard Wrangham, this hypothesis posits that for the last 80,000 years, and accelerating rapidly in the Holocene, humans have undergone a biological selection process identical to the one we imposed on dogs, cows, and pigs. We didn't just domesticate the wolf, we domesticated ourselves. To understand why this would shrink your brain, you have to look at something called domestication syndrome. When you look across the animal kingdom, you notice a strange pattern. Domesticated animals, regardless of whether they are dogs, rabbits, or sheep, tend to share a specific suite of physical traits that distinguish them from their wild ancestors. They often have depigmented skin or fur, white patches, floppy ears, curly tails, and significantly smaller teeth and jaws. But the most consistent trait of all, the universal signature of the barnyard, is a smaller brain. Domestic dogs have brains that are roughly 20% smaller than wolves. Domestic cats have smaller brains than wild cats. Sheep, pigs, and minks all show a significant reduction in cranial capacity compared to their wild cousins. It seems that whenever a species trades the dangers of the wild for the safety of human protection, the brain is the first thing to downsize. The self-domestication hypothesis argues that the 10% to 17% reduction we see in the human skull over the last 10,000 years fits this pattern perfectly. We show the smaller jaws, the crowded teeth, the thinner bones, and yes, the smaller brains. We are showing all the classic clinical signs of being a domesticated species. But this raises a confusing question. We know why we domesticated dogs. We wanted them to be manageable. We bred them to be less aggressive. But who domesticated us? There were no alien overlords breeding humans for docility. The answer, according to Wrangham and Hare, is that we did it to ourselves. As we began to live in higher population densities, reactive aggression, the instant urge to kill someone who steals your food or insults you, became a liability. The alpha bully of the Pleistocene, who solved problems with violence, would have been executed or exiled by the group in a tight-knit Neolithic village. The survivors were the friendly ones, the cooperative ones, the ones who could tolerate being crowded. We selected for tameness in our mates and our children. And in doing so, we inadvertently triggered a biological cascade that reshaped our entire anatomy. To understand how breeding for niceness accidentally shrinks your brain, we have to look at the most famous experiment in the history of genetics. A study involving a fur farm in Siberia and a lot of very angry foxes. In the mid-20th century, a Russian geneticist named Dmitry Belyaev decided to test the mechanics of domestication in real time. He set up an experiment in Siberia using silver foxes, animals that were genetically wild, aggressive, and definitely not the kind of creature you would want in your living room. Belyaev's goal was simple, but ambitious. He wanted to turn these wild foxes into dogs. The experiment was rigorous. In every generation of foxes, he selected only the individuals that showed the least amount of aggression toward humans. If a fox snarled or bit, it was out of the breeding pool. If a fox approached the cage with curiosity or licked the researcher's hand, it became a parent for the next generation. He was selecting for a single psychological trait: tameness, or low reactive aggression. He ignored everything else. He didn't care about the color of their fur, the shape of their ears, or the size of their skulls. He just wanted them to be nice. But within a few generations, something remarkable happened. The foxes didn't just start acting like dogs, they started looking like dogs. They developed white patches on their fur, a trait known as depigmentation. Their pointed, upright ears became floppy. Their tails started to curl. Their teeth and jaws became smaller, reducing the snouty look of their wild ancestors. This suite of unselected physical changes is known as the domestication syndrome. It is a package deal that seems to appear whenever a mammal is bred for docility. But the most significant change for our story wasn't the floppy ears or the curly tails. It was inside the skull. As the foxes became tamer, their brains shrank. The experiment confirmed a pattern that biologists had seen in other animals. Domesticated dogs have brains that are approximately 20% smaller than wolves. Domestic cats have brains smaller than wild cats, and domesticated pigs have significantly smaller crania than wild boars. Belyaev proved that you don't have to intentionally breed for a smaller brain. You just have to breed for a calmer animal. If you select for a personality that can tolerate living in a cage or a house without freaking out, the brain reduction comes along for the ride, free of charge. This discovery was a bombshell. It implied that the shrinking brain might not be an adaptation for efficiency or a response to diet at all. It might just be an accidental side effect of a completely different process. But why? What is the invisible link between being nice and having a small brain? To answer that, we have to look at the embryo. We have to look at a tiny group of cells that migrate through the developing face and skull, shaping everything from your adrenal glands to the size of your thinking cap. So, how does being nice shrink your skull? How does a personality trait like friendliness reach into your DNA and reshape the hard bone of your jaw and the volume of your brain? To solve this, we have to go deeper than the bone. We have to look at the blueprint of life while the ink is still wet. We have to look at the human embryo in the very first weeks of development. There is a specific group of stem cells that appear early in the formation of a vertebrate embryo. They are called the neural crest cells, or NCCS. You can think of these cells as a roving construction crew. They don't stay in one place. They originate near the spinal cord and then migrate all over the developing body to build different structures. They are multipotent, meaning they can turn into many different things depending on where they land. This brings us to the critical link. One of the primary jobs of the neural crest cells is to form the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are the chemical factories that pump out adrenaline and cortisol, the hormones responsible for the fight or flight response. If an animal is highly aggressive, fearful, and reactive, like a wolf or a wild silver fox, it generally has a very active, robust adrenal system. To build that system, the embryo needs a massive, fast-moving wave of neural crest cells to migrate to the adrenal site and set up shop. But if you start selecting for tameness, if you only breed the foxes that don't bite, you are effectively selecting for a sluggish adrenal system. You are picking the animals that don't flood their bodies with stress hormones every time a human walks by. Genetically, you are selecting for a mild deficit in the migration and proliferation of these neural crest cells. You are dialing down the intensity of the construction crew. Here is the catch. This is where the accident happens. Neural crest cells don't just build the adrenal glands, they are also responsible for building the facial skeleton. They form the cartilage of the jaw, the bones of the face, the pigment of the skin, and crucially, parts of the forebrain. This is a phenomenon known as pleiotropy, when one gene affects multiple, seemingly unrelated traits. Because the same population of cells is responsible for both aggression, adrenals, and anatomy. Face/brain, you cannot change one without changing the other. When Belyaev selected for tame foxes, he was demanding a reduction in adrenal activity. The genetics responded by slowing down the neural crest cells. But that slowdown didn't just affect the glands, it affected the whole face. The construction crew arrived at the jaw site late and with fewer workers, resulting in a smaller, shorter snout. They arrived at the ear site with less enthusiasm, resulting in floppy cartilage. And they arrived at the cranial vault with less material, resulting in a smaller brain. The smaller brain wasn't the goal. It was collateral damage. It was a metabolic side effect of turning a wild killer into a house pet. Now, look in the mirror again. Look at your flat face, your small jaw, your smooth forehead, and your reduced cranial capacity. You are looking at the clinical symptoms of a neural crest deficit. You are looking at the receipt for a process that prioritized cooperation over aggression. The theory suggests that nature didn't shrink our brains because we needed to be efficient or dumb. It shrank them because we needed to be tolerant. The 150 cubic centimeters of lost brain matter is simply the price we paid to turn off the wolf-like aggression of our ancestors so we could live in crowded cities without tearing each other apart. But this theory hits a logical brick wall the moment you try to apply it to human history. In the case of the silver foxes, the agent of domestication was obvious. It was Dmitry Belyaev. He was the intelligent designer, the man in the white coat standing over the cage with a clipboard, deciding who bred and who didn't. He was the force of selection. In the case of dogs, it was us. We chose the wolves that didn't bite, and over thousands of years we sculpted them into golden retrievers. But who domesticated us? There were no alien overlords hovering over the Rift Valley 80,000 years ago, picking out the friendliest humans to start a breeding program. There was no giant hand reaching down from the clouds to cull the aggressive ones. So, if we are showing all the biological signs of being a domesticated species, the floppy-eared, small-jawed, small-brained syndrome, how did it happen without a master? The answer, proposed by researchers like Richard Wrangham and Brian Hare, is as fascinating as it is unsettling. We domesticated ourselves. The theory goes like this. For most of our history, in the rough-and-tumble world of the Pleistocene, reactive aggression was a survival tool. If someone stole your meat or threatened your status, you reacted with instant, explosive violence. The alpha model worked. The biggest, meanest, most reactive individual often secured the most mates and resources. But as humans began to band together in tighter, more complex social groups, the rules of the game changed. We started relying on cooperation to hunt, to defend the group, and to raise children. In this new social environment, the hyper-aggressive alpha became a liability. He wasn't a leader anymore. He was a problem. He was a disruptor. This led to a profound shift in power. Anthropologists call it the transition from dominance by strength to dominance by coalition. Language allowed the betas, the smaller, more cooperative males and females, to conspire. They could whisper in the dark. They could plan. If an individual was too aggressive, too violent, or too intolerant, the group could unite to neutralize him. This could take the form of eggs, which was essentially a death sentence in the Stone Age, or it could be direct execution. For tens of thousands of years, humanity engaged in a silent, slow-motion purge of its own aggressors. We systematically removed the genes for reactive aggression from our own gene pool. The individuals who survived and reproduced were the ones who could control their tempers, the ones who could tolerate the proximity of others, and the ones who could solve disputes with words rather than fists. We bred ourselves for tolerance. We selected for the cooperative communicator over the reactive bully. And just like Belyaev's foxes, this selection for behavior carried a physical price tag. We didn't ask for smaller faces, we didn't ask for weaker jaws, and we certainly didn't ask for smaller brains. But biology is a package deal. You cannot dial down the adrenal system and the neural crest cells without shrinking the anatomy that those cells build. So, when you touch the back of your head and feel that missing curve of bone, that 150 cubic centimeters of lost potential, you aren't feeling a defect. You are feeling the biological receipt for your civilization. Your smaller brain is the trade-off for your ability to sit in a crowded coffee shop without attacking the stranger at the next table. It is the cost of being a creature that can build cities, form alliances, and live in peace. We aren't dumber than our ancestors. We are just biologically nicer. We are the puppies of the primate world, and our smaller brains are simply the mark of the kennel we built for ourselves. But this brings us to a final, critical question. We've talked about diet, we've talked about climate, we've talked about society, and now we've talked about tameness. All of these theories explain why the brain might have shrunk, but none of them answer the most important question of all. Does size actually matter? Does a smaller brain have to mean less computing power? Or is it possible that in the process of shrinking, we actually upgraded the wiring? Let's take a breath. We have spent the last half hour systematically dismantling your ego. We've told you that you are a malnourished farmer, a heat-shedding dwarf, a cog in a bureaucratic machine, and finally, a domesticated pet with a puppy dog brain. It's a lot to take in. The natural conclusion to all of this is a heavy sense of pessimism, a feeling that we are living in the idiocracy phase of human evolution, the dim twilight of a once great species. But before you spiral into an existential crisis, we need to look at this from a completely different angle. We need to stop thinking like paleontologists and start thinking like computer engineers. In the world of technology, shrinking is almost never a bad thing. In fact, it is the definition of progress. Think about the first true computers. The ENIAC, built in the 1940s, was a monster. It weighed 30 tons, occupied a room the size of a small house, and sucked up enough electricity to dim the lights of Philadelphia. It was massive, impressive, and undeniably powerful for its time. Now look at the smartphone sitting on your nightstand. It fits in your palm. It runs on a battery that weighs a few ounces. And yet, it possesses more processing power than all the computers used to put a man on the moon combined. If an alien archaeologist dug up the ENIAC and then dug up your iPhone and judged them solely by size, they would conclude that the ENIAC was the superior machine. They would say, "Look at the volume. Look at the massive cooling tubes. This civilization clearly peaked in 1945, and has been degenerating ever since. But they would be wrong. They would be mistaking volume for capacity. This is the core of the wiring efficiency hypothesis. It suggests that the reduction in human brain size over the last 10,000 years isn't a story of atrophy. It's a story of miniaturization. It argues that we haven't lost intelligence, we have simply optimized the hardware. The problem with a big brain, like the 1,600 cubic centimeter engines of the Cro-Magnons, is that it faces a fundamental problem of physics: signal delay. Your brain works by sending electrical impulses between neurons via long cables called axons. In a physically larger brain, those signals have to travel greater distances to get from point A to point B. It might seem like a negligible distance, milliseconds at most, but in the world of neural processing, milliseconds matter. Delay is the enemy of complex thought. Delay causes noise in the system. Theoretical models of neural networks show that if you want to build a faster, more integrated computer, you shouldn't make it bigger. You should make it denser. You should shorten the wires. You should pack the processing units closer together so that information can flash between them with zero latency. Under this theory, the Holocene brain reduction is actually a sophisticated upgrade. We trimmed the fat, we shortened the interneuronal distances, we improved the conduction velocity. We effectively moved from the vacuum tubes of the Pleistocene to the silicon chips of the modern era. We traded the raw, bulky horsepower of the Neanderthal for the high-speed, low-energy efficiency of the modern human. This perspective flips the script entirely. It suggests that the Cro-Magnon hunter wasn't smarter than you, he was just running on legacy hardware. He needed a bigger case to hold a less efficient motherboard. You, on the other hand, are running the sleek, compact 2.0 version of the human operating system. But how does a biological system actually upgrade itself by removing parts? How do you get smarter by destroying your own infrastructure? To understand that, we have to look at one of the most counterintuitive processes in human biology. We have to look at what happens inside the brain of a teenager. If you have ever watched a toddler try to walk, or speak, or catch a ball, you are witnessing a brain that is, biologically speaking, over-connected. We tend to assume that as we grow up and get smarter, our brains get denser and more complicated. We imagine that learning is the process of building new bridges between neurons. And while that is true to an extent, the defining characteristic of human brain development is actually destruction. When a baby is born, its brain is a chaotic explosion of potential. In the first few years of life, the brain creates synapses, connections between neurons, at an astonishing rate. By the time a child is 2 or 3 years old, they have roughly twice as many synapses as you do right now. Their heads are buzzing with a surplus of wiring. It is a state of exuberant connectivity. But this exuberance comes at a cost. A brain with too many connections is noisy. It's like a radio tuned to every station at once. The signals get crossed. The processing is inefficient. The child can learn anything, but can master nothing. So as you move through childhood and into adolescence, your brain initiates a massive demolition project. This process is called synaptic pruning. Your biology ruthlessly identifies the connections you aren't using, the weak pathways, the redundant loops, the static, and it cuts them. It literally dissolves the synapses to clear the path for the strong, efficient signals. It is a process of use it or lose it on a microscopic scale. Intelligence, entare, in the adult human, is not defined by how many connections you have. It is defined by how streamlined your network is. You get smarter by losing mass. You become an expert by destroying the noise. Now, zoom out from the life of a single child to the life of the entire human species. The wiring efficiency hypothesis suggests that the Holocene Encephalization Reversal is essentially synaptic pruning. Writ large, it argues that for millions of years, during the Pleistocene, humanity was in its childhood. We were in a phase of exuberant growth. We were piling on neural mass, building a massive, messy, 1,600 cubic centimeter brain that could do everything just well enough to keep us alive. But 10,000 years ago, we hit puberty. The selective pressures shifted. We no longer needed the raw, chaotic potential of the hunter-gatherer mind. We needed the specialized, high-speed efficiency of the modern human. So, the species underwent a collective pruning event. Evolution started trimming the fat. It selected against the bulky, redundant circuits of the ancient mind and favored the leaner, faster, more energy-efficient models. This theory offers a beautiful symmetry. Just as you had to lose brain mass to become a functioning adult, humanity had to lose brain mass to become a functioning civilization. The reduction isn't a sign of decay, it's a sign of maturation. We shed the extra weight because we finally figured out how to use the machine properly. We streamlined the software so we could downsize the hardware. And the benefits of this species-level pruning are immense. A pruned brain is a cheaper brain. It consumes fewer calories, which, as we discussed, was critical for the starving Neolithic farmers. But more importantly, a pruned brain is a faster brain. By eliminating the detour routes and the dead ends, the signal can travel from the eye to the hand, or from the memory center to the language center, with less resistance. This might explain why, despite our smaller brains, we are capable of feats of rapid-fire cognition that would likely baffle a Neanderthal. We can process complex language in milliseconds. We can react to high-speed visual stimuli. We can juggle abstract concepts with a speed that requires a highly optimized network. We are the sports cars of the genus Homo. We stripped out the back seats and the air conditioning to make the car lighter and faster. The Cro-Magnon was a tank, invincible, massive, and slow. You are a Formula One car, fragile, high maintenance, but tuned for a very specific kind of speed on a very specific kind of track. But you can't build a Formula One car just by removing parts. You also have to change the aerodynamics. You have to change the shape. And this brings us back to that peculiar change in your skull we noticed earlier, the shift from the football to the soccer ball. Because it turns out, the shape of your head is the final piece of the efficiency puzzle. Now I want you to feel the shape of your head one last time. Run your hand over the curve of your skull. It feels round, doesn't it? It has a high, vaulted forehead and a smooth, spherical back. To you, this just feels like a head. But to an evolutionary biologist, you are carrying around a geometry problem that took millions of years to solve. We talked earlier about how the loss of heavy chewing muscles allowed the skull to become rounder. But the wiring efficiency theory argues that this wasn't just a passive reaction to a soft diet. It was an active design choice. The brain didn't just get smaller, it got globular. This shift, from the rugby ball shape of the Neanderthal to the soccer ball shape of the modern human, is one of the most critical updates in our history. And the reason comes down to the physics of connection. In any network, whether it is the internet, a city grid, or a nervous system, the most precious resource is proximity. If you want a fast network, you want the nodes to be close together. Imagine the brain of a Neanderthal. It was massive, stretching long and low from the heavy brow ridges in the front to the occipital bun in the back. For a signal to travel from the visual cortex in the rear to the frontal lobe in the front, where decisions are made, it had to traverse a significant biological distance. In the high-speed world of cognition, that distance is a time delay. Now, look at your brain. By rounding the skull into a sphere, nature minimized the surface area to volume ratio. A sphere is the mathematical shape that packs the most volume into the smallest possible space with the shortest possible internal distances. In a globular brain, the frontal lobe is physically stacked on top of the temporal and parietal lobes. The wiring doesn't have to run the length of a football field. It can cut straight through the core. This geometric reorganization means that while you have fewer neurons than a Neanderthal, the neurons you do have are better connected. This is the concept of network topology. It suggests that the modern human brain prioritized integration over raw storage. We sacrificed the massive, sprawling archive of the ancients for a compact, high-speed switching station. This explains why we can process language, which requires the instant coordination of memory, hearing, and motor control, so effortlessly. Our round brains act like a dense downtown metropolis where everything is a short walk away, whereas the Neanderthal brain was a sprawling suburb where getting from one side of town to the other took a long commute. So, the reduction in size was likely the inevitable result of this packing. When you fold a network in on itself to make it faster, it naturally takes up less space. We didn't lose capacity. We just folded the map more efficiently. We are now approaching the end of our investigation. We have looked at the starving farmer, the overheated hunter, the specialized citizen, the tamed pet, and the optimized computer. We have 5 different suspects, all holding a smoking gun. The final task is to understand that they didn't act alone. We have spent the last hour acting like detectives trying to solve a murder, looking for the one smoking gun that explains why the human brain began to shrink. Was it the starving farmer? Was it the warming climate? Was it the ant-like city? Or was it the tamed wolf inside of us? The truth, as it often does, lies not in one of these answers, but in all of them combined. Evolution rarely works with a single tool. It works with a sledgehammer, a scalpel, and a vice grip all at once. The research indicates that the Holocene Encephalization Reversal wasn't caused by a single silver bullet. Instead, it was the result of a perfect storm, a convergence of powerful selective pressures that all just happened to point in the same direction, downward. Let's piece the timeline together into a single, cohesive story. The trigger was almost certainly the environment. Around 10,000 years ago, the ice retreated, and the world warmed up. This flipped the switch on Bergmann's rule, removing the need for massive, heat-retaining bodies. At the exact same moment, we adopted agriculture, which crashed the nutritional quality of our diet and forced our bodies to economize. The expensive tissue of the brain was suddenly under new management, and the budget was cut. This created a permissive environment where being smaller wasn't just an option, it was a survival strategy. But if that was all that happened, we might have just ended up as small, angry hunter-gatherers. This is where the accelerator kicked in. As we clustered into villages to farm, the social pressure to be nice skyrocketed. We began the process of self-domestication. We selected against the aggressive alpha traits of the Pleistocene and favored the cooperative beta traits of the Holocene. This biological taming dialed down our adrenal systems and neural crest cells, and as an accidental side effect, it physically shrank our faces and our cranial capacities. We became the puppies of the human lineage, physically smaller and biologically primed for tolerance. Finally, as our societies grew into civilizations around 3,000 years ago, the compensator arrived. We built complex networks of collective intelligence. We invented writing, specialized labor, and institutional memory. We offloaded the generalist knowledge that used to clutter up our neurons into the libraries and social structures around us. This allowed us to shed the redundant wiring, prune the noise, and optimize the network for speed rather than volume. Any one of these factors alone might have caused a slight dip in brain size. But together, they were a crushing force. You had the climate demanding a smaller radiator, the diet demanding a cheaper engine, the society demanding a tamer personality, and the economy demanding a specialized worker. Every single arrow of natural selection was pointing toward reduction. The result is you. You are the product of this mosaic. You are a physically smaller, socially integrated, hyper-efficient node in a global superorganism. You are not a devolved version of a Cro-Magnon. You are a specialized adaptation to a completely different kind of world. The Cro-Magnon was built for a world of ice and isolation. You are built for a world of heat and connection. He was a tank. You are a smartphone. He was designed to survive despite the environment. You are designed to survive because of your network. So, the mystery of the missing 150 cubic centimeters is solved. It wasn't stolen, it was traded. We traded raw bulk for efficiency, and individual robustness for collective power. But this brings us to one final, lingering thought. If this process has been running for 10,000 years, if we have been steadily shrinking, pruning and externalizing our intelligence, what happens next? Are we done? Or is the great shrink still happening right now as you sleep? If we accept that this trajectory has been running for 10,000 years, the most pressing question isn't about the past, it's about tomorrow. If the arrow of evolution has been pointing downward for 300 generations, has it hit the floor yet? Or are we still in freefall? To answer that, we have to look at the strange contradiction of the last century. If you look at raw data from the 20th century, you might think the trend had reversed. We got taller, we got healthier, and according to IQ tests, we got smarter. This is known as the Flynn effect. For decades, average IQ scores across the globe rose by about 3 points per decade. It seemed like we were clawing our way back to the cognitive heights of the Pleistocene. But researchers believe this wasn't a biological upgrade. Your brain didn't physically grow back to 1,500 cubic centimeters because you ate fortified cereal. The Flynn effect was a software update. Better nutrition, universal education, and a more stimulating environment allowed us to run our compact hardware at peak performance. We optimized the operating system to squeeze every drop of power out of the 1,350 cubic centimeter engine we have left. But that era of easy gains is likely over, and now we are entering a phase that makes the invention of writing look like a minor footnote. Remember the mechanism of externalization? We said that writing allowed us to store memory outside the brain. You didn't need to remember the history of the harvest because the clay tablet remembered it for you. This allowed the memory centers of the brain to relax. Today we are no longer just externalizing memory. We are externalizing processing. Look at the device you are using to listen to this. It doesn't just store phone numbers for you. It calculates routes. It translates languages in real time. It curates the information you see. And with the rise of artificial intelligence, we are handing over the keys to the most expensive cognitive functions we possess: logic, pattern recognition, and creativity. If the collective intelligence hypothesis holds true, if we really are just nodes in a network, then the introduction of AI is the equivalent of introducing a caste of super-intelligent worker ants into the colony. If an AI can write a legal brief, diagnose a disease, or solve a coding problem faster and cheaper than a human brain, what happens to the biological pressure to maintain those skills? Biology is ruthless. If you stop using a muscle, it atrophies. If you stop using a neural circuit, it gets pruned. We have already seen this happen on a small scale. How many phone numbers do you have memorized right now? 20 years ago, you probably knew a dozen. Today, you might know 2. The part of your brain responsible for that specific task has effectively been outsourced to the cloud. Now imagine that applied to critical thinking. Imagine it applied to navigation. Imagine it applied to social interaction. If we follow the trajectory of the leafcutter ant, the future of humanity might not be a race of big-brained super geniuses. It might be a race of even more specialized, even more streamlined biological units who are completely dependent on the digital exoskeleton we have built. We might be heading toward a world where the individual human brain becomes a vestigial organ, a simple interface designed to connect with the machine, rather than a standalone computer designed to understand the world. We are moving from thinking to prompting. This is the ultimate realization of the efficiency trap. By making the world easier to understand, we remove the need to understand it. By building machines that can think, we remove the pressure to think for ourselves. So the next shrink might not be measured in cubic centimeters of bone. It might be measured in the loss of cognitive independence. We might be witnessing the final transition from the generalist hunter who stood alone against the cold to the connected node who is safe, warm, and utterly reliant on the system to tell him what is real. It is a terrifying thought, or perhaps a comforting one, depending on how much you enjoy the burden of thinking. But it forces us to ask one final difficult question about the nature of stupidity. Are we degenerating? Or are we just evolving into something so different that the old metrics no longer apply? So, here we are, standing at the end of the evidence, and we have to answer the question that has been lurking in the back of your mind since we started. Are we living in an age of idiocy? Does the fact that your skull is smaller than your ancestors mean that you are, fundamentally, a degraded version of a human being? It is the natural fear. We equate size with power and volume with value. To see the graph line go down feels like a failure. It feels like we are the lazy heirs who squandered the family fortune. But this perspective makes a critical mistake. It judges a fish by its ability to climb a tree. We have to reframe the definition of stupidity. If you were to teleport a Cro-Magnon hunter into the middle of Times Square or Shibuya Crossing today, he would likely collapse in a state of catatonic shock. He would be unable to process the sensory overload. He would be unable to navigate the subtle, invisible rules of traffic, commerce, and social hierarchy that you navigate on autopilot every single day. He would be dumb in your world, just as you would be dead in his. We are not dumber than them. We are specialized differently. The Cro-Magnon brain was an instrument of ecological intelligence. It was tuned to the frequency of the natural world. It was designed to read the wind, track the movement of herds, and understand the physics of stone and wood. It was a massive, standalone processor built for a world of silence and solitude. Your brain is an instrument of social intelligence. It is tuned to the frequency of other people. Think about the sheer computational power required just to function in a modern society. You have to constantly read the micro-expressions on the faces of the people around you. You have to detect lies, sarcasm, and deceit. You have to maintain a mental ledger of debts, favors, and shifting alliances. You have to understand abstract symbols, money, laws, brands, internet slang that have no physical reality but govern your entire life. This is not easy work. In fact, some anthropologists argue that social navigation is the most cognitively demanding task a primate can undertake. The reason we can do it with a smaller brain is not because the task is simple, but because we are optimized for it. We pruned away the wilderness survival modules to make room for the diplomacy modules. We traded the ability to outsmart a wolf for the ability to outsmart a neighbor. This brings us back to the concept of the superorganism. This is the only perspective that makes sense of the Holocene reversal. If you look at a single human being in isolation, yes, we look fragile. We have no fur, small teeth, weak claws, and a shrunken brain. We look like a biological mistake. But humans don't exist in isolation. We never have. We are the most dominant species on this planet precisely because we stopped trying to be robust individuals. We put all our chips on the collective. We traded individual hardiness for network dominance. A single ant is a weak, mindless creature that can be crushed by a raindrop. But a colony of ants can strip a forest bare, build climate-controlled cities, and wage war on a global scale. The colony is the unit of survival. You are a cell in that colony. The reduction in your brain size is simply the specialization required to fit into the hive. You gave up the jack-of-all-trades brain so you could plug into the master-of-the-universe network. So are we idiocracy? No. We are Borg, but nicer and with better coffee. We are a hive mind that has distributed its intelligence across billions of nodes. The fact that you don't know how to build a car is irrelevant, because the species knows how to build a car. The fact that you don't know how to cure a disease is irrelevant, because the species knows how to cure it. The capacity for brilliance hasn't left the building. It just moved from the individual desk to the cloud. We likely possess the same raw potential for genius as the Cro-Magnons. If you took a modern baby and raised them in the Pleistocene, their brain would likely wire itself differently. It wouldn't prune the survival circuits, it would strengthen them. It wouldn't specialize in reading smartphones, it would specialize in reading tracks. The hardware is smaller, yes, but the plasticity, the ability to adapt, is still the defining trait of our genus. We are not broken. We are not degenerated. We are simply the most highly tuned, socially integrated, and efficient version of Homo sapiens that has ever existed. We are the version that won the game. We just had to leave a little bit of luggage behind to cross the finish line. And now, as the night closes in, we can finally look at the whole picture. We can step back from the microscope, put down the calipers, and see the story of the last 10,000 years for what it really is. It's not a tragedy. It's a transaction. So we have reached the end of the trail. We have traveled from the frozen tundra of the late Pleistocene to the neon glow of the modern city. We have stood face to face with the giants of our past, the robust 1,600 cubic centimeters hunters who conquered the ice. And we have looked in the mirror at the graceful 1,350 cubic centimeters humans who built the internet. It is a journey that forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality of change. Evolution is not a sentimental process. It does not care about our vanity. It does not care about our desire to be the biggest, the strongest, or the smartest creature in the room. It only cares about one thing: what works. And for the last 10,000 years, what works has changed fundamental. We started this story with a paradox. How could the species that invented quantum physics and heart surgery have a smaller brain than a species that lived in caves? But as we have peeled back the layers of biology, climate, and society, the paradox has dissolved into a clear, logical picture. We realized that the reduction wasn't a mistake. It was a receipt. Think about what we bought with that missing volume. We bought a warmer world. When the ice retreated, we traded our massive, heat-retaining bodies for slender, efficient frames that could survive in a temperate climate. We shed the bulk because the world stopped trying to freeze us to death. That was the first down payment. Then we bought security. We traded the dangerous, high-protein diet of the hunter for the reliable, stored calories of the farmer. We accepted the expensive tissue tax. We allowed our brains to shrink because, for the first time in history, we had an insurance policy against starvation. We traded the Ferrari engine for the economy sedan because the economy sedan doesn't run out of gas every time the hunt fails. Next, we bought peace. This was perhaps the most expensive purchase of all. To live in villages, towns, and eventually cities of millions, we had to surgically remove the reactive aggression that defined our ancestors. We had to domesticate ourselves. We selected for the friendly genes, the tolerant genes, and in doing so, we accepted the side effects of the domestication syndrome. We accepted the smaller jaws, the softer faces, and the reduced cranial capacities. We traded 150 cubic centimeters of brain matter for the ability to look a stranger in the eye without fighting them. And finally, we bought connection. We moved from the generalist model, where every human was an isolated island of knowledge, to the specialist model, where we are all connected by a web of collective intelligence. We offloaded our memory to libraries and our survival skills to the economy. We pruned the redundant wiring in our heads to make room for the high-speed social circuits that allow us to function as a superorganism. When you look at it this way, the Holocene Encephalization Reversal isn't a story of loss. It is the story of the greatest trade deal in biological history. We traded individual robustness for collective invincibility. The Cro-Magnon hunter was a magnificent creature, a masterpiece of solitary engineering. But he was alone. If he broke his leg, he died. If he forgot the path, he was lost. You, with your smaller, rounder, inefficient brain, are never alone. You are buoyed by the knowledge of billions of other humans, living and dead. You are protected by a social immune system that spans the globe. We have transitioned from being the hardware of the planet to being the software. We don't need to be big anymore because the network is big. The genius of the human species is no longer locked inside the skull of a single chieftain. It is floating in the air between us, in the conversations, the books, the servers, and the laws that bind us together. So the next time you feel a moment of doubt about your own intelligence, or you worry that humanity is losing its edge, remember the weaver ant. Remember that the most sophisticated societies are often built by the most specialized individuals. We haven't stopped evolving. We have just changed the direction of the arrow. We stopped growing our brains because we started growing our world. We stopped investing in the individual processor because we started building the global brain. And you, lying there in the dark, are a vital, humming part of that incredible machine. You are exactly the size you need to be. Wind down. Now, I want you to let the weight of that history settle around you like a heavy, warm blanket. The timeline is closed. The debate is over. The scientists have put away their calipers, and the fossils have returned to the Earth. You don't need to solve the mystery of your own biology tonight. You don't need to worry about the size of the engine or the efficiency of the wiring. The machine has done its work for the day. It has processed the light, the sound, and the stress of the waking world. And now it is time to power down. Feel your physical body sinking into the mattress. Visualize that expensive tissue we talked about. The muscles of your jaw, the tension in your temples, the focus behind your eyes. Imagine the energy draining out of them, flowing down through your neck, past your shoulders and out through your fingertips. You are no longer a hunter on the tundra, scanning the horizon for threats. You are no longer a farmer watching the sky for rain. You are no longer a citizen navigating the complex web of the city. You are just a breathing, resting creature, safe in the nest you have built. The external hard drive of the world is holding everything for you. The books will remember the stories. The servers will remember the facts. You don't need to hold on to anything right now. You can let go of the cognitive load. You can let the social brain take the night shift while you drift away. Let the darkness of the room wrap around you. The world is quiet. The network is humming softly in the background, a lullaby of connection that keeps you safe. You are part of something vast, something ancient, and something deeply, profoundly human. Drift down into the quiet space where the thinking stops and the dreaming begins. Good night.